Ye is the greatest artist of all time. If that sounds like a big claim, watch this video and I will explain exactly why. It is just what it is. It has to do with the context and the time he's alive, but Ye is at a position in history that historically will be remembered in a very significant way. So basically, what I'm referring to is his art. It's not that he is a successful musician. It's not that he's, has the biggest numbers. That's not what I'm talking about. I want to explain what his work means in relation to art history. So, Ye started his career as a producer who samples. This is a great example of recontextualizing the past in a modern, contemporary light, and in doing so, giving it a new meaning and a new way to understand how we can connect the past to the present. A common, or like a popular example of this is the sample on Blood on the Leaves, using the Nina Simone song about people being lynched for trying to get free from slavery and comparing that to blood on the leaves. In that song is about literal blood on literal leaves. And in the context of Yeezus, it's about blood on the money. Meaning, what are the ways that that sort of history of oppression has modernized itself and has new ways of, like there's kind of new ways we can discover the present by looking at the past. So he's one of the first people. He's not the first person to sample, but he's basically the first mainstream person who was really sampling music like that with intentionality and meaning behind it. So that is a very common theme throughout all of his work, and that is something that is really important in relation to art history, and that's what I mean by it really is a thing about the time he's alive, because this is the first era ever with the internet, and he is one of the first ever online influencers, along with a bunch of other people. But this is where he really separates himself from the pack as far as how history, specifically art history, is going to look back at what's happening right now. And that's where the numbers don't really matter. That's where, the awards don't really matter. And I believe that it's really important to understand some of the art history context. So I'm going to jump real quick. There's classical art, and everyone is just painting what's really there. And the people who are doing that have to get really good at understanding the visual perception. So they get really good with lines, they get really good with shadows, and they have a deeper understanding of the way we see things than most people could even comprehend. From there, we start to see emerging these different ways that on a painting, they try to reflect reality that are abstract. And this happened alongside the advent of cameras. So the kind of foundation of modern art that's split between classical art and modern art is starting to look at quote unquote non-realistic, or you could argue more realistic, but a painting at that point isn't a one-of-one representation of what they're seeing from one perspective, because the thing I'm looking at right now is completely changed when I come over here. Like, that door moves like this. The perspective is really crucial to the thing that you're seeing. And this was a concept that was happening on canvases, and it has started to reach a political effect, a social effect that really matters. So from that kind of futurist movement, which started out with, there was a guy who was a poet, his name was Luigi something, and he got in a car crash in 1908 in Italy, a car crash, and after that he wrote a manifesto about the future and embracing the future, because what made him get into a crash is he's in a brand new car, meaning like this is one of the first cars ever created, and there was two people on a bike in the road, and he had to swerve out of the way and ended up in a ditch. This futurist manifesto ended up being the fascist manifesto. The same guy who wrote this art manifesto wrote it for Mussolini. And I say that to talk about how impactful and important art history or art movements are to the history, the political history of the world. And the futurist whole idea was really embracing like the idea of industry, the idea of work, and the idea that we create the future. So what came out of that was these really aggressive ideas of how they could make society. This dude who wrote those manifestos was so radical that in Italy, he wanted to ban pasta. And that's an example of how these futurists really wanted to reinterrogate everything about their lived experience. And from there, we start to see, well, from there, World War I happened. And as far as the artists go, that was enough. The artistic movement, left that headspace at the end of World War I, although the political ideology ended up being the engine behind World War II. So where artists went from there is this thing referred to as Dadaism, more conceptual art, and that's where you see performance art come about. Joseph Beuys, I think is his name, he locked himself in a cage with a wolf, and it was like a 3-day thing, I think, and that was kind of his like gesture of art. So at that point, artists are basically leaving the canvas and more interested in finding different perspectives on their lived reality as a way to catalyze within the audience a further understanding of the way that what they see shapes who they are. The visual input that we have, as well as the other sensory input, is what defines our mind. Okay, now that's a brief art history. Jump to something like pop art with like Andy Warhol. The Campbell soup can wasn't about looking at the Campbell soup can on a wall and being like, wow, this is beautiful. This is more beautiful than the sunset. It's exactly the opposite. It's about how the commercial elements of life, the advertisements and branding and marketing and product and industry and all these different things basically dictate what we see, and are becoming what we see. So after that sort of pop art movement, things got pretty cloudy, because the idea of inquiry, looking into ways that consumerism affects us, it's not necessarily a level playing field, because the incentive structure of our lives is to make money. So in order to make money, you need people to buy stuff. So that's kind of why we are way more likely to see things that are consumer based on selling us something, because what I'm getting at there, I hate that I lost my train of thought. What I'm getting at there is that the artistic movements of modernism and abstract art and abstract expressionism were increasingly frustrated with their limitation to access everyday people. They were sick and tired of being stuck inside of a gallery because that's only for rich people. It was only for the elites of society. So how are they going to make any sort of, political change with an awareness of the things that happened as a result of futurism, knowing there's a lot of importance on the ways that they're able to enlighten the human perspective. And it seemed as if you saw increasing ways that artists became frustrated with the only way to even manifest their work, like even pay for the materials to make something, was to make a consumerist product or compete in a consumerist market. And I think what Warhol was getting at too gets into this idea of, if you can make advertisement actual art and not just visual art, actual art, like art at that conceptual art phase, when that guy locked himself in the cage with a wolf, the real serious artists from then had recognized that it's way beyond like painting at this point. It's about making moments. Well, it's even when you look at a painting, if someone makes a painting, it exists in the moments that I look at it, and in those moments that I look at it, I see stuff. So they recognized that moment as the art and found a lot of different ways to interpret that and express that and interrogate that. So take it back to Ye, the producer who got in a car crash and started the entire kind of wave of modern rap music. The elements, like that, another element of his time being so important is he's kind of one of the first people to master this digital era of production. And the sampling he was doing on his original records, like this guy was buying physical vinyls, physical music, and I don't even know how they did that. I guess the ASR-10, that machine, like would take this music and I don't think that's the right machine. Take the music and find different ways to manipulate it to give it a new context. So I'm going to make a quick jump here to fashion. And there's the character storyline. I'm not trying to get into that. This guy was from Chicago. Everyone said he couldn't do it, but he did it anyway. We know that. So by the time we get to season 3, the show he was doing and the shows he was doing around that time for years prior were really stepping into performance art. As the Glow in the Dark tour started, after that he was working with Vanessa Beecroft on pretty much all of his visuals. And she was a very well-known and established performance artist. And, some people credit her with really encapsulating a new style of work where she would very visually present the human body. And we see Ye really kind of step into that performance art idea with Yeezy Season 3. And what we see there is, at Madison Square Garden, there's this giant kind of platform, or a few platforms in the middle of the stage, and then there's also a bunch of people down low, below where the stage is. So all of the people up top on the higher platforms, on the elevated platforms, were models and rappers and celebrities and influencers, and everyone who was on the lower level was kind of just regular people. So all of the people at the top were wearing Yeezy Season 3 clothing, but all of these regular people were in Yeezy Season 3 and looked like they were wearing Yeezy clothing, but they were actually wearing different vintage and thrifted and reworked clothing. And this represented that awareness of influence. So it wasn't about the products he was showing off with the influencers. It was about the gesture of providing the same level of aesthetics that they were wearing and they were doing to everyday people. And the artistic brilliance and importance is the way that he was able to visually deal with color and also deal with the form, shape, and function of clothing in a way that outcompeted branding, in a way that was so harmonious with the presentation of the human body that it people gravitated towards dressing like that and using those tones, whether they know it or not. I've seen like so many replicas of Yeezy slides. I've seen so many earth tone hoodies, and the show itself basically leveled up the entire industry's awareness and engagement with color. But so much of what was happening at that show was actually focused on emphasizing these vintage pieces from the past. The show would take direct references to stuff like Carhartt jackets and the Margiela sweater, the Margiela sock sweater. So these really cool looking sweaters that you see on some of the women in the show are based off the pattern of a sweater that Margiela made out of leftover military socks. And Ye's entire fashion career, I think the biggest influence, in my opinion, is Margiela. And Margiela's work really focused on fashion being not the clothing, but the overall act of visual expression of the human. And the thing that Margiela did so well was take these concepts and execute them at a level that was so good and so interesting. It made people back then have to stop and question the ways that they understood clothing, because the stuff that Margiela was doing with leftover military materials looked better. So what Ye did with season 3 is take the foundational elements of minimalism, modernism, and this appreciation of the past and recontextualized it into the clothing line of the hottest rapper of the year. And it's Ye's ability to bring these movements into the mainstream that is exactly what artists for the past 100 years have been fighting to do. Break out of these institutions, break out of these galleries, and rather than let a curator or some sort of billionaire make a decision on what art gets shown and what art gets interacted with, kind of doing that in a public setting, in a public space. And an artist has a duty to reflect the times. So, like, Nina Simone said that. And another thing Nina Simone said was that she wanted people to feel jarring and feel like shocked when they left her shows. They didn't want people to feel happy because shit wasn't all good. It's not all happy, It's like Tupac said when they asked him, like, why are you talking about all this, like, violence and all this? And he said, well, I'm just talking about what's happening. When it stops happening, then people will probably stop talking about it. And that's where so many of the ways that Ye's best moments and his best expressions have been the most flawed, open, and honest and vulnerable moments. So another example of Ye recontextualizing the past and bringing it into the present is this short film that's made for the album Bully. It's taking a scene from a movie called Santa Sangra, which is about how childhood trauma can can make us do stuff as adults that we aren't even consciously aware of. The way that the traumas and fears and insecurities that we build as young people stay with us and are the cause, the root of so many of our issues and our flaws. And in that film, the main character is described as like a serial killer you can be empathetic for. And in the the scene that's recontextualized for this short film was a woman named Saint in the film was the character who was in that boxing ring. So his son Saint was playing the same role as in the movie this woman Saint. And what this woman Saint in the movie represented, which was played by a completely jacked man, is that this guy kept going around killing all of these women he was with. And he needed and he saw an advertisement basically for the world's strongest woman. And he really sought out to go see this person. When he goes to see Saint, it's that scene that's in the Bully film. He basically tries to kill her like he did with everyone else, but it didn't work this time. And that was basically the start of him having to come to terms with and deal with his traumas and insecurities. And then he recognizes by the end of the film that he was literally physically being controlled by the ghost of his dead mother. And he only regained autonomy, regained control of his hands when the police came at the end of the film to arrest him for murdering a bunch of women. And you see how that little boy in the film was so pure and innocent, and there was traumas and fears that he didn't understand that took apart his life, the child in the movie. And it wasn't until he was truly at the end of a reckless path, at the end of a, horrible series of hurting different people who were just trying to care for him, he realizes that his trauma was in control. Kind of like our Fight Club, you have Tyler Durden, And to use that as that one scene to connect that to his story and what was happening with him, that is an example of not just, recontextualizing something. No, that is the start, that is the philosophical beginning of how the entire future is going to work. I'm talking about building houses, I'm talking about designing products, references. Everybody loves references. And, the best of Yeezy is non-referential, but the ways in which Yeezy and Ye and his output are able to crystallize these samples and these references and actually turn them into something better. Disregard what is useless and empower what is useful and provide that to the people. So that Yeezy Season 3 show, it's all about the influence that he has over the perspective of the daily person, and in that instance, their opinion on something like clothing. Eventually, by the time we get to something like Donda, you have this, oh my god, dude, I feel so freaking insecure right now about all the ways that I'm jumping this way and that way and this way and that way. But if I try to edit this into a coherent video, it's going to take me 2 or 3 years. So I'm just going to make this for now for anyone who's interested. The basic idea I'm getting at here is that artists started to realize how much the present, the right now, is just an amalgamation of the past. So to be able to decipher the bad and not throw away the good is really important, because we can recycle, we can upcycle, we can sample and rework all of this information that we only just now with the internet have access to. And what's interesting is that, like, I don't think it's necessarily the lyrics that matter anywhere nearly as much as the living person, the living character, and then the relationship those lyrics have. Like, y'all been leading with hate, I just approach it different. Like a gang truce, the first blood to shake a Crip's hand, is like his approach with that song with T.I. when he's kind of being canceled for wearing the red hat. And you could totally see that, like, the MAGA Kanye was just about how many people were telling him he couldn't be that. It's almost like it was like a dare. It's like he had to be that. And that is a very kind of defining through line of his whole career, is whatever people said he couldn't, that's exactly what he ended up becoming. And it got to this place where he just broke the limit of the social order, to the point where today, as of 2026, most reports suggest that he is banned from ever doing a show in America. But the artist has a responsibility to reflect the times. So if Ye gets banned from performing at any stadium in America, that is simply a reflection of the times. And the framework of how he samples music and how he samples in clothing and how he deals with his position in culture and society has and will go down in history as the most wide scale and large impact that any artist, as far as art history goes, has ever had directly on individual people, where they are directly engaging with this person. It's like we see him in 2015 talk about clothes, and he's like, I can't even make a t-shirt, for less than $100, and no one's giving me a chance, and I just want to do it. And all the interviewers are like, but why? You're so good at music, you're a legend, what are you doing? They're talking to him as if, like, Tom Brady said he wanted to play soccer. And then you 5 years later go to the gym or go to the mall and you see more Yeezys than Nikes, and it's like the ability to give people the whole truth like that, meaning you don't just see, the person talking. You see the person talking, and then you see the cultural response. You see the way in which the moment is the art. You see the way in which the audience is responding. So what Ye's output is about is not what he's doing, what he's saying. It's what he's doing and what he's saying in relation to the context. You think you fell out of a coconut tree? From the context of his time and position as a celebrity, a rapper, a fashion, even my ability to say rapper, fashion designer, billionaire, architect, like, that's new, that's genius. And it's like so many of the ways that he came out the gate was about challenging and redefining the black identity in America. And he ends up at a point of interrogating and redefining culture, the thing that defines identity, culture as a whole. And, I don't think what I'm saying has anything to do with, like, being right or wrong. It's being a person and showing when you're right and when you're wrong, and when people tell you you're wrong and you end up being right, and when people tell you you're right and it ends up being wrong. And the ways people say they want, positive changes in the world, but then something like crack music comes out and we don't put the transcript in museums. Crack music lyrics are how we stopped the Black Panthers. Ronald Reagan cooked up an answer. You hear that? What Gil Scott was hearing when our heroes and heroines got hooked on heroin. Crack raised the murder rate in D.C. and Maryland. We invested in that. It's like we got Merrill lynched. And we've been hanging from the same tree ever since. Sometimes I feel like music is the only medicine. Like, that's crazy. That's crazy. Like that J. Cole could never. What are we talking about? Drake could never. But we don't even reward that. We like Gold Digger. And I think Ye recognizes all of the ways in which he's obviously very flawed as a person and blah, 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 blah. But it's like one of the biggest contributions he has to society is showing us the power of self-belief in such a new way, in a way that's more documented and more controversial and more pop than anything as far as art of the past goes. Art today in 2026 is still in such an academic place that when I speak about this concept of art stepping away from the canvas and moving into a curation of our perception via an awareness of how our sensory input over time defines our humanity's output into the world. People haven't quite grasped that. Like, we're still think that art is like arts and crafts, and it's not to say that's worse. I love arts and crafts. We need craft in order to experience beauty. It's extremely important. But art is like the reason it's worth hundreds of millions of dollars is, not because the paint was just like immaculately put on the canvas. It's because it is a reflection of the times. And there's so many ways that Ye may not be perfect or right, but is a reflection of the times. And if you made it this far, I love you. Thank you for sticking around. Thank you for getting through this because, like I said, I really would love to add overlays and images. And I should have said this at the beginning, but when I'm like saying stuff, you can just pause it and Google it for me. If you could help me out and do that, that'd be great, because the resources I have are limited. So please, if you want me to be able to help give you this information with more ease, like I can add all the overlays and I can show the visual examples of what I'm talking about, but I literally am just do not have the resources to do that. I run out of storage as soon as I try to edit any sort of long form video. So please like and subscribe. And yeah, I would love to hear anyone's feedback. If you liked it, if you hated it, if you overrated, underrated. I don't even know what I just said. I mean, there's so many points I wanted to make. I don't know if I made any of them. The fit crazy though. This is how I make a point right here. This jacket was like $20 on Grail. This is better than anything. I guess if I were to summarize what I'm talking about, it's how before Yeezy Slides, I don't think anyone was making one-piece slides. And after Yeezy Slides, every company on earth makes one-piece slides. And that guy is the same guy who made a song about sucking his cousin off. And that's the same guy who made Jesus Walks. And it's the same guy who made all the other stuff and all the different ways you can engage with identity, and that your context informs your identity, and the amount of information and awareness you have decides who you are. So be yourself to the best of your ability and be aware that what you see impacts you no matter what, whether you think it or not.